Right. So, welcome to Learn Something New today. This is a new venture, a new podcast with Anthony Millian, myself. And today we have someone really interesting. This is our first episode. So, we wanted to start it off with a bang. We have, I call you a professor, historian,
Mm.
teacher, all the cool things. We have Dr. Tim Johnson in the building with us, and we're going to be asking him some questions today. How are you today, sir?
I'm doing wonderful. I just finished first week teaching students this, so I'm like in semi-recovery mode. I'm doing well considering.
Very cool, very cool. Well, thank you for wanting to be on the show today and for kicking off our first episode. I've been following you for quite some time. We've both been following each other for quite some time, and
Yeah.
you're far more of an expert than I am. I didn't go to school for history. Um, I've been a history buff, but not that I don't know what I'm talking about, but you know what you're talking about. Um, so tell us a little bit about your background and like how you got started with history and learning about history, and let's go from there.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. I think you're selling yourself short, saying that you're not very. I love it. I love all your videos, and it's been really encouraging because I kind of had an itch to get on social media and start talking about history, but I don't know how to do that sort of thing. So when I got on there and everybody's like, "Oh, you need to follow Anthony. Like you have to get on there and um, see how it's done." So I really appreciate your tutelage. But yeah, I was kind of born into history. My dad's a big history buff. He was like a lawyer, but grew up just loving history, and family history is really big in my family. My family's from Chicago. My mom's family's from Michigan. My dad's family's from Chicago. So I was born into a family that has lots of lore. Like today, for example, my students came in, and I have this letter, the paper, like the naturalization papers of one of my ancestors who came from Norway. Um, and it's been saved in my family, and saying this person renounces their allegiance to the king of Norway and is now an American citizen. And so there's like documents like that hanging around at
Right.
my house. So I love showing that to my students, though, because I teach a demographic where there's tons of people who are, I had a kid arrive from Venezuela in my class today. Like he just showed up, and to be able to say, look, everybody's, we're all part of this American story. So that's, even though that was several generations ago, it's very much like kind of part of our identity. Um, so my love of history is I just always love reading. And I think like there's like I was trying to think about it today about what moment it was in my life where I kind of knew I wanted to be a historian. And I can kind of pinpoint this moment when I was on a family road trip in I think it was my freshman year of high school. And we were driving from Chicago to Savannah, Georgia. And we stopped at this rest stop, and there was a sign, and it said Jefferson Davis Memorial, and it was like 10 miles off the highway. And so my dad and I looked at each other and said, "Well, let's see what that's all about." And so we drove off the interstate, and it's right near the Abraham Lincoln birthplace. And we drove there, and there's like an obelisk. It's like the Washington Monument. It's this massive obelisk in rural Kentucky, kind of near the Tennessee border. I wrote down the name of the town. I can't. Fairview, Kentucky, which I don't think has much else going on aside from this Confederate monument. And we stopped there, and it was on a weekend, and it was this huge kind of gray, like drab, unkempt Confederate memorial that's the size of the Washington. Not, it's maybe aspires to be as big as the Washington Monument, but we were looking at it and just kind of saying, "Huh, this is odd." And it was surrounded by low income like government housing, and it was just people out in the weekends barbecuing, mostly people of color, surrounding this Confederate monument. And I just remember thinking like this is really a weird place and a weird thing to have this neighborhood that was mostly a largely black neighborhood that was like at the center of it was this monument to Jefferson Davis. And I remember just not having the words for it or kind of realizing it, but just seeing how incongruous this was at that moment and just thinking like, this is just America's an unusual country. There's a lot going on there. So that was a moment that I've kind of like looked back at that and I was like, that was maybe one of the moments where I realized I really wanted to be a historian. But I went to college, I studied history. I ended up getting a PhD in history at the University of Georgia. And I can talk about my research and things like that there. But I was fascinated in the history of Reconstruction and the kind of the post-Civil War era, what happened to the freed people after the Civil War. And those were kind of the questions I came in with. What happened? How did the country put itself back together? What did that look like? And I think it kind of almost traces back to that moment, seeing this Confederate memorial, which is sort of funny, just considering how present those conversations have been in the last few years since George Floyd. It's they've only become more poignant in the last few years.
Right. Right.
So
So, in your opinion, what are the most critical historical events that have shaped America in the way it is today?
you know, critical historical events. I mean, I could say the Civil War. That's absolutely a big part of it, and I would tend to say the Civil War, especially considering the legacy of Reconstruction. Um, but just thinking of the 20th century, I mean, I have to say the New Deal to me is a really important time period in FDR, just because it sort of encapsulates so many things that America has aspired to do. America has, semi succeeded at doing, and some of the things that it hasn't succeeded. Just at this moment of absolute crisis when the Great Depression happened, and electing somebody who was full of hope and sort of radiated positivity. He built this huge political coalition that brought together white Southern, segregationists, people of color from across the country, immigrants. All these people voted for this guy because they knew that he was kind of swinging for the fences, and they tried lots of experiments out, and some of them are things that have really important legacies that built some of the infrastructure of daily life, like government healthcare, social security, things that we sort of expect government to do now that it hadn't been doing up until that point. But then also some things that the government tried to do that might have been a good idea on paper, but in their execution just didn't quite land. Like, for example, the Homeowners Loan Corporation and the Federal Housing Administration, which ostensibly wanted to help people keep their homes and get low interest home loans, but then in the execution of those programs, they handed it over to the realtors of the country, who by and large were white landowners and people working for banks who ended up sort of carving the country up into areas that were considered desirable real estate that were reserved for wealthy white people. And this is the beginning of redlining, and so much of where, I mean, really where most of us grew up, whether you grew up in the city or a town. Like, I grew up in Evanston, Illinois, just north of Chicago, and it's the legacy of those things is just like right at the surface of what our communities look like now. And these are sort of legacies of a big government program many generations later, but we're still sort of untangling all of these things. So I think the New Deal is, I could make a good argument for that being a really important event and period of time, just for sort of shaping life as we see it now, both in aspirations of trying to fix problems and make things right, but then also sometimes those aspirations kind of going horribly wrong.
Right. I think one thing that I really think is interesting about the New Deal is that they tried to make it inclusive for everyone, but at the
Mhm.
same time, they made a lot of concessions to make sure specific demographics were not included. Like, they would say like,
Mhm.
oh, if you worked in a rural community or if you were a farm worker, you weren't eligible for this. But most of the people that worked in those were Black and brown people. So
Hmm.
it's really interesting
Hmm.
to look at it through the lens of like, oh, we're trying to help everyone except for you, and you just happen to be
Hmm.
everyone that we don't like. So
Right.
very
Right.
interesting to say the least. So let me ask you another question. When it comes to the study of history, how do you feel like with contemporary events, um, we our study of history and like learning history can help us understand contemporary events?
Hmm. Hmm. Well, I mean, one thing that, I don't know. I'm generally a pretty optimistic person, and I try to be optimistic. And so often in the last few years, I'm sure everybody in every generation has says this, that current events make them feel pessimistic. And I don't know, just lots of things that have happened in the last few years have made me feel pessimistic. So I try to draw on the stories of like individual people, as a way of trying to stay optimistic, to learn the ways that people have been, sort of resilient, in spite of their challenges and things like that. So, I mean, there's so many things that we can learn, but just thinking about resilience, I don't know. Especially going through the process of becoming a person who's trying to sort of pitch stories on social media, which I know, like it's sort of this instant feedback
Right.
situation where you've got like a really fascinating story that you want to tell, and it might be really fascinating to you, but then you realize that, yeah, people don't necessarily always like want to hear it. And
Yeah.
I think that one thing that I've learned that people are interested in hearing, and what I draw a lot of inspiration from, is just finding people that, in spite of their challenges and the things that could, make them throw their hands up and be pessimistic, people who sort of find a way through, just kind of inspirational stories. And those are the things that I find that, viewers, or, people on Instagram reels or whatever, seem to be more drawn to. So trying to think, like a video that I made last year about people in Gee's Bend in Alabama, the quilters that live in this place that has just faced so many challenges since it was settled in the 1830s, and it was, essentially a slave labor camp in a bend in the Alabama River, where there was, displacement of Native Americans, and then these enslavers bringing people in from points east, and, chopping down the forest, turning it into, a cotton camp. And yet, like, and all the way going forward into the civil rights era, when people there tried to assert their right to vote, during the march to Selma, local power brokers cut their ferry access off to make the community there even more isolated, and, tried to withhold services to people who are basically just trying to survive in this
Right.
really difficult corner of America. And yet, here's this community that has made some of the most incredible art that America has, distinctive and beautiful art that America's ever produced, in spite of just these complete, just enormous challenges. So, finding stories like that, that's one big thing I take away from history, is just like learning the resilience of people, that the way that they kind of push back against some of these sort of hopeless tides of history. It's
Right.
something that I really, draw a lot of inspiration from.
Absolutely. One thing I find really interesting is how often history repeats itself and we don't realize it because we don't
Mhm.
like know. I mean, I guess like if you don't have the time to really, or if you don't have the desire to really learn history, you're not going to realize
Mhm.
it's repeating itself. Like I was looking at the Democratic Convention of like the 1968, I believe, and looking at it
Yeah. Mhm.
like looking at what was happening in America at the time and looking
Mhm.
now, and I'm just like, wow,
Oh.
it's very similar. Like the Lyndon B.
It was
Johnson,
also in Chicago. It
yeah, it was
was
also
in
in
Chicago
Chicago,
that year. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Lyndon B.
Yeah.
Johnson like didn't want to be president anymore. He wasn't running for a second term, and Biden did
Hmm.
the same thing, and now we're having a
Yeah.
Democratic convention that's in 1968 they centered a lot of women, like Mary Lou Hamer. Excuse me, was it Mary Lou Hamer? Yes, it was Mary Lou Hamer, Shirley Chisholm, and now we're coming full circle in Chicago where we're centering Kamala Harris, somebody that's they're gonna might be the
Hmm.
first Black and Indian president of the United States. So I thought it's really it
Hmm.
blows my mind how much history repeats itself when it comes to just and maybe it's because we're people, we're American, and like we tend to be a little bit crazy, and but it's wild to me how much it does. But you know um for you personally, like what is a common
Hmm.
misconception about your field of history and your field of study
Hmm.
that you would like to correct?
Huh. Well, man, there's so just in terms of my like career trajectory, I guess. So I got my PhD. Like I was trained as an academic historian, and I still am doing history with primary sources, and I have a book project kind of cooking. But at the moment, I'm a classroom teacher. I'm teaching high school history, and I think one, just in terms of thinking of myself as a historian who's practicing in the high school classroom. One thing that I sort of bristle at is there's a lot of headlines in the last few years, which are all, I mean, they're based on real things that are happening around the country. And luckily, I haven't like been pulled into these cross currents, but all these fights about books and about what's taught in the classroom and who's allowed to teach what. And there are laws, there's a law in Georgia, I think, that you're supposed to not talk about sexual or anything related to homosexuality. I don't remember exactly. It's not quite as stringent as the Florida law. So there are real things happening that are problematic in terms of what's legislated about what you can talk about. But going back to my optimism, I think that these are these headlines happening about sort of these culture wars happening in schools, and yet there's a lot of things just in terms of the students that I see every day that make me feel kind of optimistic about kids growing up today, that they're, how do I put this? People seem more accepting of one another in ways that I hear adults talking about these things, fighting the culture wars, but it seems to be less embattled among actual like kids in the classroom.
Yeah.
And when I'm teaching about difficult topics, things related to race, things that are really uncomfortable topics, that a lot of times you'll hear adults say things like, why do you focus on the bad stuff? Like kids want to learn these things. They're excited to learn about uncomfortable history. Like that's not something that I don't know. I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is that the kids are all right in a lot of ways. Like I find things to be optimistic about just in terms of the students that I teach. I'm sure, it's not the same everywhere, but I just, there's been so much media attention on these culture wars that sometimes we kind of like lose sight of like a lot, like some of the currents of the tides of people's attitudes towards one another, I think are moving in positive directions. And I kind of see that in the classroom. I mean, kids are still kids, obviously, but I'm encouraged by that for sure.
Yeah, same here. I mean, you mentioned you live you there's a law in Georgia, there's a law here where I live in the South, and essentially where you can't teach certain subjects and you can't make students feel uncomfortable, and this is all centered around not teaching about slavery and making sure specific demographics feel comfortable while others their history is neglected.
Hmm.
Um and the
Hmm.
thing that I find really interesting is that the Gen Z and Gen Alpha, people say all
Hmm.
kind of stuff about them, but like you said, they're okay. Like the kids are
Right.
okay. They're very vocal. They don't take any shit from anybody, and they're
Hmm.
very like they push back. They don't, and I
Hmm.
love that about this generation. If you want them to work outside of their regular work hours, you're gonna have to pay them more for that. If you don't want to teach something, they're going to ask why. This whole concept of like oh, just go with the flow, or what's the term here in the South? Go along to get along. Is so foreign to
Mm.
them. But yeah, so let's see here. We have a couple more minutes left. We have about 10 more minutes. So I'm gonna skip some of the questions.
Hmm.
Um,
Okay.
so, you know, um, what are some primary sources that you use for research when it comes to your if somebody was to come and like, hey, I want to be a historian, but I don't have time for the academia, what are some primary resources that you would consider using?
It's so dependent on what a person's interest is or what their interests are. So it's really just like, follow whatever your passions are. And that's one of the great things about history today is that it encapsulates so many, there's such a wide array of sub disciplines. I mean, if you're into like gender, if you're into art, if you're into the history of race, if I was really interested in the history of the environment, and I ended up finding all sorts of really unusual documents. Like I found documents that were um, sort of promissory notes related to debt that sharecroppers accumulated for borrowing money to buy fertilizer in the years after the Civil War. So if you're a cotton farmer, you really to grow cotton in the 1870s and 80s in the South, people were using fertilizer, imported fertilizer for the first time. And the first fertilizer that was imported to America was guano. It was like bird droppings that came from South America. And so there was a document called a guano note that people had to sign that basically said you're putting your entire economic like life signing on the line at the beginning of the year, signing away your economic life in order to borrow money to buy bird dung. And
Yeah.
then at the end of the year, this was something that a landowner could use to deny your access to credit, to do basically whatever they wanted to. It was part of this whole sharecropping system, but borrowing money literally to buy crap,
Right.
which I was, and in fact, it was like one of the largest sources of debt among cotton farmers after the Civil War. And I hadn't heard anybody talk about it before. So like, when you start digging into whatever your specific interest of history is, you're going to find these unusual things. So it's never been easier to dig up primary sources, to get online. Like there's so much great digitized information. So, I mean, the main piece of advice would just be like find whatever it is you're passionate about, and then start looking. Who's got collections and archives related to whatever it is you're interested in, and chances are you'll probably find something. And when you can't find something, then you have to dig a little harder, and that's where you kind of make your mark as a historian.
One of the resources
Mm-hmm.
that I really love, and it's free, is the
Mm-hmm.
Library of Congress and also the Smithsonian.
Mm-hmm.
All the pictures on there are public use.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I found really interesting, because I made a video for a client about Juneteenth, and they were like, "Where did you get these images
Mm-hmm.
from?" And I was like, "Oh, just from Google." They were like, "Oh my God, no, we can't use it because this might be somebody else's stuff." But then I realized, oh, if I go
Uh-huh.
to the Library of Congress, they're all open source, so it helps
Yes.
a lot.
Yeah.
And last question, while we finish things up, is if you can go
Mm-hmm.
travel back in time and witness a historical event, what would it be and why?
I'm supposed to like say like the assassination of Lincoln or like meet Jesus or something, but um, I think there's like a mystery in my family. My great grandfather disappeared in 1916 in Idaho, and I'm just sort of curious. Like he either took all the family's money and like disappeared, or he drowned in a river, and it's really unclear whether he died, like whether he was a crook or whether he was a guy who was like trying to go buy a team of horses for the family. And so it's a really personal thing. It would just like settle this long-standing family mystery if I could figure out what happened to great grandpa Jack. So it's not as big as and ambitious as like meeting a famous person. It's more just like it's this sort of unsolvable, intractable family mystery that I'm really curious about.
That is so cool. Because it's really interesting because
Yeah.
there was a massacre in Puerto Rico, and I was talking to the family historian. She lives in Puerto Rico, and she said that,
Mm,
you know, some people in our family, they after the massacre, they left the part of the island and went elsewhere. So what you'll see in the history records is like all these the same first names in the census, but different last names. And
mm.
like it's not that people like they died or anything, they just moved and changed their names. So
Huh.
it's really interesting to see. And I wonder, like, a lot of times, like, how often that happened where people like were said to have disappeared, but really they just
Yeah.
went somewhere else and they went because they went 2 counties over and just like changed
Mhm.
their name. And back then, travel is not like how it is today. Like, I can drive to Atlanta in 2.5 hours. And
Mhm.
like, you know, back then it would be 5 days, you know, and I might die in the
Mhm.
process of
Yeah.
dysentery. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's really, really interesting to see. Well, Dr. Tim, thank you for being here. One last thing, if
Mhm.
people want to find you, if they want to engage with your content, where do they find you? Shout yourself out.
Just look me up. I'm Dr. Tim's History on Instagram or YouTube or I was gonna say Twitter. No, TikTok. I was gonna say, yeah, TikTok. So Dr. Tim's History is the best place to find me, and there's links there. So please do look me up.
Awesome, awesome. Well, thank you again. Take care, okay?
Th- Thanks a lot.